Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Food for Thought webinar with Professor Steve Thomas. We will be talking about behavioral insights into savings and retirement decisions. My name is Aneesh Banerjee, and I'm with the Faculty of Management. As you know, if you're a regular visitor to our sessions, you would know that we typically give 2 or 3 minutes for everybody to join in and settle down, and then we will start our conversation. Okay, I can see that you don't have to raise your hands, just so that you know. If you have a question, you can always put it in the chat or in the Q&A function, and I will pick up your questions from there. Yeah, so feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function, and I can take your questions from there, so you don't have to raise your hands. Okay, it's just past 1. It's 1:02 on my clock over here. So let's start our conversation and welcome everyone. Clearly, a lot of you are interested in behavioral finance, or behavioral insights into behavioral finance, and that's really the topic of conversation today. Yeah, most of you, I'm sure, already know who Steve. Steve has been with CAS for a long time, the business school, formerly CAS, for a long time. He's a very senior professor in finance. He's also the associate dean for all our MBA programs. And I, as you know, I'm also the course director for our global MBA program, and it's an absolute privilege to be working with Steve on the MBA programs. And we were having this conversation one day, and we were talking about some of the behavioral finance bits, and one thing led to another, and they requested Steve to do a talk, and he was kind enough to agree. And so he will be talking about some of the behavioral insights from some of his students' studies on retirement decisions, so to speak. A quick reminder, as you know, this is a weekly webinar. So next week, we will be discussing the US elections. So keep an eye out for that. It should be an interesting one. The one after that is about telling African stories from cultural and creative industries. And the one after that will be about Brexit and business. So keep an eye out for these 3 interesting webinars that are in the pipeline. But today's discussion is all about decisions around savings and retirements. So without further ado, over to Steve. And once again, before that, please, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A in the chat function. But over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Aneesh, and good afternoon to everybody. I am physically here, would you believe, in the business school, formerly known as CAS, in my office. And hopefully we will be resuming normal service in the near future. As Aneesh said, I have responsibility for the MBA suite of programs, and we are back teaching reasonably normally at the moment, and so let's keep our fingers crossed. Before we come on air, Aneesh rather cruelly suggested that there was a picture of me and my wife there on the seafront at Bournemouth. Maybe not so cruel, but actually it's not me, but it just illustrates, it's from The Economist of a week or 2 ago, the wide interest in the issue of saving for retirement, and the general idea that certainly in developed countries, there's insufficient savings to meet the needs of a glorious retirement. And this has sparked a wide range of research into how we can stimulate more retirement savings. When we're young, we don't think too much of this far distant event of retirement, and people tend typically to undersave. But this word undersave has got huge ethical connotations, which we can briefly revisit. What is the appropriate level of savings? I came into behavioral finance as an empirical economist about 30 years ago, when it was relatively in its infancy as a subject. I came at it as an investment specialist, an investment strategy economist, where we were trying to understand patterns of returns in stock markets. And this guy, Richard Thaler, who got the Nobel Prize in a year or 2 ago for behavioral finance developments, he had written some nice empirical pieces on the momentum in stock returns, of a mean reversion after so many years and so on. And it applied to many asset classes. But the great insight for me was it opened the door into behavioral aspects, because so much of the economics I had done in my PhD and subsequently really didn't have a lot of justification in behavioral terms. Now we were moving into a zone where we were having investment strategies such as herd effects and momentum effects, having some underpinning from a separate sort of literature to do with psychology and related subjects. So Thaler took me into that. I then met Shlomo Benazzi, who worked with Thaler on many papers. Shlomo ran the Allianz Center for Behavioral Studies at UCLA, and he wrote some many important papers with Richard Thaler. And he has actually been involved in some of the research I'm going to talk about today through my PhD students who are sponsored by that center in America. So that's how I stumbled into behavioral finance. But there's one particular aspect I learned along the way, which I've been delighted in the research I'm going to show you, and get delighted that it actually is a bit different from how I started designing investment strategies. What was missing always was the ability to have proper experiments or proper field studies on how people behave. The aggregate macroeconomic relationships or investment relationships I was modeling through econometrics really didn't talk about individuals very much. Where we've moved to in the last 20 years, certainly, is some really interesting studies where we have real people making real decisions. And I'm very fortunate that two extremely smart PhD students, very mature, running various retirement businesses in America, have access to thousands of individuals' behavior. And that's what I want to talk about briefly this lunchtime. As I said, I came across Shlomo Benazzi in the mid-1990s, and he got together with Richard Thaler, and they got quite famous. Now, this is just an example how we can nudge financial behavior by designing stimuli and nudges to overcome psychological barriers. Various barriers such as pre-commitment, procrastination, inertia in people's decision-making. How would you get them to change their behavior? So people don't want to see a reduction in their take-home pay because they're giving more into their pension pot. And the Save More Tomorrow paper got huge exposure, Journal of Political Economy, 2004. This paper, which showed a method of trying to persuade people to save more, was firmly based upon, you have it, a sample of real people making real decisions. And that to me opens up a lot of interesting things where we can take a little bit further, and that's what these students have done. As you can see on the bottom of that slide, the increase in savings through changing the nudges can be very substantial indeed in securing a greater involvement by workers and savers than if left to their own devices without these stimuli. The second example, just to show it's not all Thaler and Benazzi. The Wall Street Journal really loves Shlomo Benazzi, and they write about his technical research. And a very interesting one came out 2 or 3 years ago. It was a German study. And basically, before retiring, you should take a very simple test, a very simple Q&A, 2 questions. And this will help reveal if you're retiring too early. And the impact of retiring too early for people is a very substantially reduced pension, and obviously maybe a longer time to withdraw it. And that, again, was based on purely the biases we know people have, present bias. If we know we've got these biases, we can design policies to try and overcome them. So everywhere we look, we are seeing aspects of behavioral finance. When I talk to business executives, they are fascinated by behavioral finance and behavioral context, let's call it, because there's wider business issues, than any other thing we talk about when we're talking, say, to bankers or the like. They find people can engage with it very naturally, and they can all relate to the predictions. So I have these 2 PhD students. One has just finished. He was head of research for Voya at VOYA, which is one of the biggest pension administrators in America, and as such, had responsibility for keeping the records for many thousands of mid-sized US corporates, which meant, of course, inside each pension scheme, there were probably hundreds of people. So we had access to a lot of savings information about how people make their choices. Voya also an asset manager. And now Voya also sponsor, would you believe, the behavioral finance or behavioral economics unit at UCLA, which Shlomo Benarzi is involved in. So Voya have become a major player in this, and they've kindly allowed Rick Mason, to complete a fantastic PhD, which was examined either earlier this year or late last year. The second study is based on work by Steve Shue, and David Smith is involved closely with this as well. And we're mixing up some laboratory data and some real US savings data. And we're looking at how can you design savings plans to appeal particularly to gig economy workers, because they typically have very erratic income patterns, and it's been observed they are very reluctant to save. Can we design savings structures to encourage them? This came because Steve was living in Los Angeles, where, of course, in California, the gig economy was a big issue. So both of these projects, I want to very briefly give you the summary of how they fit into all this. So Rick Mason's PhD, Digital Enrollment Architecture and Retirement Savings Decisions. It was a great eye-opener to me. It was a great eye-opener because I just read a book called The Smarter Screen by Shlomo Benarzi, which is a great airline travel book. And it opened up not just for finance, but I mean, marketing has got some great lessons from it. How does a design of a digital screen actually influence people's choices? And that's what Rick really picked up on. This is obviously the non-technical version, but there's a big literature on choices which interact with the idea of screens and digital choice to show you how you can influence people's choices. Visual biases and behavioral patterns, they all influence our thinking, whether on the smartphone, the laptop, or the desktop. Screens are not neutral, was the lesson we took into Rick's PhD. And the little game I show people to motivate this is, let's play Battleships. There are, 10 by 10 squares. You hide 10 ships, and I have 5 shots at them. What's the chance of me hitting them? Well, if it's purely random, it's an 88% chance you hit a ship. But if the guesses are random, they are not random. People do not guess randomly. They guess the outer rows half as often as they are random. The upper middle is guessed 3 times as much as random. You can hide in the outer rows, reduce the chance of being hit by a factor of 6. This is called middle bias, and there's some wonderful examples being explored by the psychologists and the behavioral guys on this. For instance, if you're looking at a screen with an X-ray, an MRI scan, we know that radiographers miss growths very much so when they're on the edge of the screen, much more so than in the middle. The CIA, when they look at satellite images, they have to split the pictures up into smaller squares because otherwise they'll miss something with a higher probability at the corners and at the edges of the picture. So there's a well-developed literature on the biases to go with this. So how did Rick exploit this? Well, Rick was interested in a number of things. The layout of the screen is the subject of one of his chapters. So I think that's pretty pertinent here. Let's have a quick look at it. Your employer gives you a choice about enrolling in a pension scheme. What can influence that choice? Simply from the screen itself. Answer, is it laid out vertically or horizontally? What is the choice of the color? What is the choice of the use of the English language, a precise wording? Now, it's not an accident that on the website landing page here for Rick's example, the choice on the left is do it yourself. The choice in the middle is let the company get on and manage it for you through the auto-enrollment procedure. And on the right, you really don't want this one. I don't want to save. And given the middle bias, people, other things being equal, would do it for me, which would encourage them to sign up for the scheme and let the pensions company get on with it. And as I note there is this bias in the way we look at things. We go left to right, but obviously in linguistic environments with other language setups, we can go from right to left. But that's a simpler example of what Rick was investigating. And because he had thousands of individuals playing this game of signing up for pensions, and of course the ethical considerations are massive, because you are actually potentially leading people in different directions, which may or may not be, in inverted commas, good. We have to be very careful how we proceed with this. So the first thing is the employers have to be fully aware of what's going on, and you take it from there, and then there's full information provided, etc., etc. But we're very aware that, of course, encouraging people to save a lot if they've got big debts is not that smart. So we have to be careful on that as well. The other thing Rick was very interested in was anchoring. If you make suggestions to people about what percentage of income they should put aside for savings, you will probably, but it was not known before, you would probably influence their behavior. Now, of course, again, you come back to the ethics of it. What number should you put as a sort of anchor reference point? There's a huge literature on anchoring, and it's fascinating and amusing in equal measure. But Rick was playing around with numbers like the default would be 6%, and then you try, as in the next slide, you try 8% or 10%, and you'd see the extent to which people would maybe drop off if they don't want to. 6%, by the way, was not an arbitrary number. It's enshrined, is accidentally enshrined in US behavior through an example in the 401k legislation of all things, but it seems to have become a reference point. But anyway, having played with these choices for people, I just give you a quick summary of what was found there. You can see the employers are reluctant to raise the default rate for two reasons. One, it might actually make it unhealthy for people because they might have high credit card debts and they really should be paying those off first. But also importantly, and perhaps from an employer's point of view, more importantly, you might scare people away and they'll suddenly jump out and go to zero. Well, the great thing about this study was the first to show that actually people don't jump out and go to zero. With default rates up to 7, 8, 9, 10, 11%, people are incrementally saving more relative to the 6%. They are not dropping out. They are not reducing their savings behavior. And the bottom left result there suggests that after 2 months, so they've got a chance to pull out, you check it after 2 months, and of course it will be checked subsequently now for more research, an extra roughly up to 0.5% extra is saved off a basis of about 6%. So it does lead to what looks like a small increment in savings, but you look on the top right and you would do that over 30 or 40 years and it accumulates quite substantially to increase your savings. So the conclusion, higher default contribution rates merit serious consideration as a tool for improving retirement preparedness. Erring on the high side, that's okay. People were a bit unsure about that before. Put that together with the design of the screen and you have some powerful conclusions. So please beware of the ethical aspects of any of this if you try it yourselves. And then very briefly, I want to mention what Steve Shu's been up to. Here you are in Los Angeles, you are observing the behavior of a gig economy and you're observing that there is a shortage of savings behavior, a bit different from conventional shortage of savings behavior. People have a very different reward pattern, irregular, uncertain, etc. So Steve managed to get a field experiment set up, both in terms of the labs and also in terms of real people in real policies, working with a financial institution in California. And one of the first questions is, if you ask people to save on a daily amount versus a weekly amount versus a monthly amount, does it change their behavior? And it does. It changes it quite noticeably. And certainly for poorer, lower income people with irregular income flows, allowing people, in this case on an app, a financial technology app, to save daily, you'll see a substantial increase in the number of people saving relative to the same amount spread over a month. Okay, so we call this framing deposits in more granular terms. It reduces the participation gap between the better and worse off. And as I say, there are 3 times as many consumers in the highest income bracket rather than the lowest bracket participated when it was $150 a month. But you switch this to a daily $5 a month, which is the same amount, and the participation gap is eliminated. So that's essentially what Steve has been doing. And I briefly show you here, and I'll make it very brief. This is the 4 papers which we are working on, and David Smith is co-author of these. We're looking at the relationship between expressing savings in percentages versus in absolute, what they call penny terms, mental accounting of savings. And you find that pennies, people particularly lower income, will actually lead to more savings behavior if you express it as pennies per dollar rather than percentages. And one of the driving forces of this is the level of financial sophistication. In America, there's a wonderful literature and research groups on financial literacy. So you can measure financial literacy, and we find that's a very important conditioning variable for the degree of understanding and how it affects behavior with savings. The second paper is temporal reframing and participation in a savings program is actually a complete field experiment and already published in Marketing Science. And the 2 we're working on at the moment is a more sophisticated version of pennies versus percentages with real people doing real decisions, as well as a lab version. And then we're building into a real gig economy question of temporal reframing and savings under income uncertainty. You can ask real people, how uncertain is their income in terms of how regular has it been in the last few weeks or whatever, and you can divide people up into a sort of regular income, less regular income, highly irregular income, and then you can ask them, in addition, how does granularity in withdrawing and putting into savings actually affect their behavior? And what you find is, of course, no surprise, the more uncertain people's income, the more you need this ability for the daily saving as opposed to the monthly. These are early results, which we're still developing, but I think it's a very interesting, exciting area where real people are being used, and they are being used in a very constructive way. A bigger question is, how much should people save at an ethical level? We acknowledge that, we recognize it, as do indeed the savings companies. So I think I've had 20 minutes. Aneesh, would you like me to, there are more slides which people can look at, but more importantly, if anybody would like the actual papers, I'm very happy to enter into a dialogue separately.
Sure. Thank you so much, Steve. I already have a couple of questions that have come in, so perhaps it's a good time to pause and get into a little bit of a conversation on this. So one of the things is clearly some of these insights that you mentioned can definitely be used for designing different kinds of applications. A lot of these are mobile applications that a lot of fintech companies use these insights to design their fintech applications. And I can name quite a few that use these kinds of techniques. One thing that is very interesting in the market these days, and that's the question about, which is anchoring using some social or peer effects. People who are like you, they are on an average saving 7% or 10% of their income. Or people of your profile are saving something. To what extent are these, first of all, ethical? What are the ethical concerns about it? And of course, in your experimental designs, have you already considered some of these peer anchors, which may actually be even stronger, perhaps? Does that work?
And there's a related one I didn't mention, and you've jogged my memory, is the escalation rates, where many company schemes now have an increase from 6 to 7 or 7 to 8 on a regular automatic basis. And that again is there's a perhaps a weaker ethical consideration there. And one of the things we found with Rick's PhD is that people are not fazed by the automatic escalation. They are
Right.
very much comfortable within the limits we're talking here of 6, 7, 8, 9. Escalating by 1%, you might think people aren't too bothered about. How about escalating by 2 or 3%? They're not bothered about that within certain ranges as well, which I think is quite interesting, which shows that people's appetite to ability to adjust their spending patterns when things are sort of presented to them in a more passive way that they don't have to react to, they will accept it. But the ethics is massive, and I don't know the answer to it because I think it's
Right.
deeply personal, deeply personal. And whenever there's a PhD exam in this area, it's always either the first or last question, and
Right.
I've never heard a persuasive answer. The only thing I can say is that on a personal level, you should make everybody totally aware who is
Right.
participating in what's going on. That does beg the question: if you're given a digital screen question,
Yeah.
they are making a choice. Now, obviously, if you point it out to them, when most people choose the middle one, I'm not quite sure how that, we don't actually say that. It's
Yeah.
probably revealed subsequently.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, actually absolutely, and in fact that kind of very nicely relates to a question that Harish is asking, and this is essentially a lot related to the financial literacy argument that you were also making. But his question is around tax incentives, which is especially in the UK, for instance, if I'm a gig economy worker, I can actually gain different kinds of tax incentives if I put it in a self-invested pension plan, etc. Right? Which I wonder how many people are actually generally aware of, and how many people are using that benefit. So is that
yeah.
also part of the equation, the education and the tax incentive?
Um, it's not explicitly, but it's a good point. The point I made about the 401k plans in America is a great example of an accident, because people in America talk about 6% of income being saved. That number 6 came from the first draft of legislation on 401k, which was using an example of the employer putting 3% in as a match contribution to the individual, and 3 plus 3 is 6. The employer
Right.
typically puts in 3. And this is 30 or 40 years ago. Ever since then, people have talked about 6% as being the reference amount. It was only
Yeah.
given as an worked illustration. There's no moral or economic oversight to that. But you're right. I think this is obviously the tax-free amount is what people typically have been missing out on and not understanding. And one of the arguments about the inadequacy of information is that the obvious matching by employers and the tax benefits is being missed by so many people. But is that present bias or is it ignorance?
Yeah.
The present bias being the fact that they really don't want to give anything up at the moment, which is
Yeah.
why that the Nazi failure is so clever, because you actually never see less money in your salary. You only ever put more into your pension pot when you have a salary increase. A loss
Yeah.
aversion is avoided, which is so clever and so simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't talk
We are
about tax. No.
right. We are almost at time, but I know you had a slide later on, which was also very interesting, and perhaps you can really comment on it, which is the absolute amount of saving versus the percentage of saving. And if people are told 6% or 7% versus if they're told $150, they
Yeah,
react differently as well, and which is also clearly a matter of awareness.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, so the lower income people will save more if it's in pennies or dollars rather than percentages. By the time people want about $50,000 a year, the reaction is the same, and over $50,000 a year, it basically the guys who are looking at percentages are comfortable, whereas guys looking at pennies aren't. Financial literacy is much under investigated, I
Right.
think. And that's what this is about. You need a measurement of it, which in the States they're very good at, some simple questions. And as a conditioning variable in a lot of this saving stuff, it's a very powerful conditioning variable.
Right. See, we are at 1:30, and I promise I'll let you go at 1:30 also, because I know you're going to apply what you were just talking about in practice. So thank you so much for taking time out and speaking with us. Thank you. And see you, everyone. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.